On a chilly autumn morning at New York International Airport, an older woman with a modest appearance stepped up to the check-in counter. Little did anyone know, she was the mother of a hidden black billionaire and was about to teach those who underestimated her an unforgettable lesson. Watch how this incredible story unfolds. The crisp autumn morning sky enveloped New York's International Airport, where the bustling crowd moved like an unrelenting stream. The steady announcements echoed through the air, mingling with the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases and hurried conversations. Passengers wrapped in thick coats passed through the large glass doors, revealing a vast, brightly lit interior under the glare of white lights. Amid the throng, a woman entered the check-in area, her demeanor quiet but undeniably striking. This was Marissa Blake, a 62-year-old widow. Her salt and pepper hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a modest brown coat, carrying an old leather bag in one hand. Petite in stature, Marissa's steps were unhurried. Her sharp eyes, softened by a calm resolve, scanned the surroundings, from the busy check-in counters to the ever-changing flight information boards. Her gaze seemed as if searching for something, yet it was the look of someone who had weathered many storms, observing her world with meticulous care before making a move. Today was no ordinary day for Marissa. This flight wasn't just a journey from one place to another. It held a deeper meaning, a piece of the story she and her son, Nathan Blake, had been writing together over the years. Slowly, Marissa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a first-class ticket, handling it with the care of someone holding a treasured keepsake. She read the details again, her eyes lingering on the bold print. First class, Flight 745, New York to Los Angeles. She moved toward the check-in area, where long lines of passengers were waiting to complete their procedures. Marissa spotted the separate, less crowded counter reserved for first-class passengers and walked over. Behind the counter stood Linda Collins, a woman in her early 30s, her blonde hair tied back neatly and her uniform impeccably pressed. As Marissa approached, Linda glanced up. Her eyes flicked quickly over Marissa before landing on the ticket in her hand. For a brief moment, her brow lifted slightly, but she masked the reaction with a practiced, professional smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Linda asked, her tone polished but distant. Marissa offered a faint smile, stepping closer as she handed over the ticket. Her voice was steady, calm. "Good morning. I'd like to check in for Flight 745. Linda took the ticket but hesitated slightly, her eyes darting back to Marissa as if scrutinizing her. Then, with a polite but measured tone, she asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you sure this is your ticket?" Marissa raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unshaken, though her gaze turned sharper. A small, knowing smile appeared on her lips as she replied, "I believe I know what I'm holding." Linda didn't respond immediately. Instead, she frowned slightly and began examining the ticket more thoroughly than necessary. She flipped it over, entered its details into the system, and stared at her screen as if searching for an error to validate her suspicion. The atmosphere grew uneasy. A few passengers in line behind Marissa began to glance over, curious about the delay. Marissa remained still, betraying no impatience, but inside, she understood all too well what was happening. After a few long moments, Linda finally handed the ticket back. But rather than apologize for the unnecessary delay, she offered a strained, perfunctory smile and said, "I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any mistake." Marissa accepted the ticket, her eyes never leaving Linda's face. She smiled faintly, giving a polite nod. "Thank you." As Marissa turned to leave, she caught Linda whispering to a colleague nearby. "Who does she think she is? First class? Must be some mistake." Marissa didn't turn around, but she heard every word. Still, she kept walking, her steps steady and unyielding, leaving behind the weight of suspicion and prejudice that lingered in the air. Marissa walked through the security checkpoint clutching her first-class ticket, but Linda's snide whispers still echoed in her mind. "Who does she think she is? First class? Must be some mistake." Those words were not new to Marissa. She had heard them many times throughout her life. If not directly, then indirectly, and each instant served as a painful reminder that prejudice lingered, no matter how hard she tried to rise above it. As she entered the first-class lounge, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The room was quiet, furnished with plush leather chairs and an elegant refreshment bar. The passengers here, mostly business people dressed impeccably, read newspapers, typed away on laptops, or sipped coffee in serene comfort. Marissa chose a quiet corner, placing her bag on the seat beside her. She sat upright, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting a few curious and even scrutinizing looks. But she paid them no mind. "I don't need to prove myself to anyone," she reminded herself, a mantra that had guided her through much of her life. Meanwhile, Linda Collins was still thinking about Marissa. After she'd left the counter, Linda turned to her colleague, Karen, and whispered, "Can you believe it? Someone like her with a first-class ticket." Karen, uninterested in gossip, shrugged and replied dismissively, "Maybe someone bought it for her, or it was some kind of promotion. Either way, if her ticket is valid, it's none of our business." But Linda couldn't let it go. She felt as if she'd missed something, as though Marissa's ticket carried a secret she had failed to uncover. She couldn't understand how a woman with such a modest appearance, showing no visible signs of wealth, could possibly belong in first class. When the boarding announcement came, Marissa stood, picked up her bag, and made her way to the gate. At the boarding desk, Linda had now taken over. Seeing Marissa approach, Linda straightened up, her eyes scanning the older woman with even more intensity than before. "May I see your ticket, please?" Linda said, her tone professional, but her gaze betraying a lingering suspicion. Marissa smiled faintly, saying nothing as she handed over her ticket. Linda took it, inspecting it with meticulous care, flipping it over, and double-checking the information on her screen. "Is there a problem?" Marissa asked, her voice calm but sharp enough to make Linda hesitate. Caught off guard, Linda quickly composed herself. No problem," she said, but she continued her unnecessary scrutiny for another moment before finally handing the ticket back. "All is in order. You may board," Linda said. Marissa took the ticket, nodding politely. "Thank you. I hope this time you're sure I have the right ticket." A faint blush crept onto Linda's cheeks, but she said nothing, watching in silence as Marissa walked past. On the plane, Marissa settled into her first-class seat. The wide leather chair, attentive service, and private space offered every luxury. Yet for Marissa, the comfort wasn't what mattered most. Her eyes gazed out of the small window, watching the pale gray sky gradually turn a soft blue as the plane ascended. Elsewhere in the cabin, Linda moved through the aisles, assisting other passengers. Each time she caught sight of Marissa, a flicker of discomfort crossed her face, coupled with a nagging curiosity she couldn't shake. Marissa noticed Linda's glances, but responded with only a faint, composed smile. She understood that Linda's attitude wasn't something she could change overnight. Still, Marissa knew that patience and quiet dignity were her strongest responses. During a brief pause, Linda spoke quietly to Brian Jacobs, the flight's lead attendant. Brian was a seasoned professional, known for his calm demeanor and no-nonsense approach. "Brian," Linda whispered, "do you think she really belongs in first class?" Brian raised an eyebrow, fixing Linda with a firm look. "Linda, I think that's not for us to decide. Our job is to ensure every passenger is treated with the best service, no matter who they are or what they look like. I suggest you remember that." Linda shifted uncomfortably under Brian's gaze, but chose not to argue further. Throughout the flight, Marissa remained observant, lost in her thoughts. She couldn't predict how this story would unfold, whether it would spark a larger change in Linda or perhaps in a system riddled with biases. But she was certain of one thing. Her quiet strength and unwavering grace would always be her most powerful tools. Marissa sat quietly in her seat, her eyes gazing out the window as layers of white clouds drifted past. But her mind had traveled far, back to a moment from long ago. Memories of her youth came rushing back. Memories of her time as a teacher in a struggling neighborhood where judgmental stares and injustice were far too common. 1985, at a small school in the American South. Marissa, then in her early 20s, stood at the front of a cramped classroom with peeling walls and worn-out desks. It was the classroom she had volunteered to teach in because she believed the children there deserved a chance as much as anyone else. But reality was not kind. Most of her students were children of color, born into poverty and burdened not only by material deprivation, but also by the weight of societal prejudice. One student stood out vividly in her mind. Jerome, a bright boy often dismissed by his peers and even some teachers because of his family's hardships. One day, Jerome brought in a science project, a homemade model of a hydroelectric plant crafted from scavenged materials. When Jerome stood before the class to present, a teacher passing by happened to glance into the room and made a sneering remark. "What good is this junk? That boy should focus on learning how to work with his hands." The words struck Marissa like a knife to the heart. She saw the pain flicker in Jerome's eyes, but instead of reacting immediately, she stepped forward, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and said, "Jerome, this idea is wonderful. Can you tell us more about how you think your model could work?" Jerome lifted his head, his eyes shining with renewed hope. He began explaining in detail, his voice gaining confidence as he went on. By the time he finished, the entire class erupted in applause. Marissa smiled, knowing she had done the right thing. After class, she spoke to Jerome privately, telling him never to let cruel words define him. "You are valuable," she said. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Back to the present. Marissa sighed as thoughts of Jerome and students like him filled her mind. She had seen so many talented, extraordinary people pushed to society's margins simply because of prejudice. That was why she had taught her son, Nathan Blake, one of life's greatest lessons: to use success not as a tool for revenge, but as a means to change the way the world sees itself, and to never lose his humanity in the process. Nathan had always been a curious child, asking questions about the injustices he witnessed growing up. Marissa vividly remembered the first time Nathan asked her, "Mom, why do they treat us like this?" "I didn't do anything wrong." Marissa knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and replied, "You didn't do anything wrong, Nathan. But sometimes the world will judge you because they don't understand you. What you need to do is prove them wrong, not by arguing, but by living with kindness and becoming stronger." She always believed those lessons helped shape Nathan into the man he became, a black billionaire who kept his identity out of the spotlight, focusing instead on creating meaningful change. This flight wasn't just a journey for Marissa. It was a reminder of the path she and Nathan had walked together, from days of struggle to the heights of their achievements. A small smile graced her lips as she looked at the endless sky outside the window. The encounter at the check-in counter hadn't left her angry. Instead, it reminded her of the strength she had cultivated over a lifetime of defying prejudice. Linda, though unaware, was a reflection of the very society Marissa had spent her life confronting. But Marissa didn't harbor resentment toward her. Instead, she saw an opportunity for people like Linda to learn that the world only grows better when we let go of our biases and open our hearts to recognizing the true worth of others. Marissa thought to herself, "Every journey is a lesson, and this journey will be one of the most important, not just for me, but for everyone I encounter today." Marissa sat still in her seat, her memories of the past settling like a calm lake after a storm. She took a deep breath, letting the serene atmosphere of the first-class cabin surround her. The plush leather seats, the gentle glow of light streaming through the windows, and the steady hum of the engines created a symphony of calm. Yet beneath the surface, her thoughts churned like an unseen current. Marissa knew that every moment of today's journey held significance. The snide remarks from Linda Collins at the check-in counter, the scrutinizing glances from other passengers. These were reflections of the battles she had faced throughout her life. But instead of feeling wounded, Marissa felt fortified. "This isn't just my story," she thought. "It's the story of millions of others who've been judged by appearances rather than their true worth." As the plane began its descent, Brian Jacobs, the lead flight attendant, made his way through the first-class cabin for a final check. He stopped beside Marissa and offered a warm, professional smile. "Mrs. Blake, how was your flight? Is there anything else we can do to make you more comfortable?" Marissa looked up and met his kind, genuine eyes. She returned his smile gently. No, thank you. Everything has been just fine. Brian nodded but hesitated, sensing something unspoken in her gaze, a quiet depth, a story untold. He started to move on, but paused, then asked, "If there's anything you'd like to share about your experience, we're always here to listen." Marissa regarded him for a moment before replying softly, "Thank you. Perhaps someday I will. But I think this lesson isn't just for me. It's for all of us. And sometimes the best way to learn is to observe and reflect." Brian nodded thoughtfully, her words leaving a lingering impression. He walked away, leaving Marissa alone with her thoughts once more. When the plane landed, Marissa moved through the baggage claim area with a composed demeanor. She pulled her small suitcase behind her, her eyes focused straight ahead. She didn't notice Linda Collins standing behind the service counter, but Linda couldn't take her eyes off Marissa. Since the flight, Linda had been preoccupied with thoughts of her. Brian's earlier remarks had left Linda feeling unsettled, forcing her to confront her own actions. Though she wouldn't admit it outright, deep down Linda knew her behavior toward Marissa at the check-in counter had crossed a line. Watching Marissa now, Linda couldn't shake the thought, maybe she's not just an ordinary passenger. Marissa exited through the airport's large glass doors, greeted by the bright sunlight of a new day. A car waited for her outside, and the driver quickly stepped out to open the door as she approached. Before getting in, Marissa turned briefly to glance at the bustling airport behind her. She smiled a quiet, meaningful smile. This is just the beginning, she thought. In her heart, Marissa carried the story of Nathan Blake, her son, a man quietly reshaping an entire industry. His journey was proof that patience and compassion could achieve extraordinary things. And today's flight, though just a small chapter in her life, reaffirmed her belief in that truth. What Marissa didn't yet know was that today's events would spark a chain reaction, one that would not only shape her and Nathan's future, but also challenge many others to reevaluate their understanding of kindness and fairness. The announcement echoed through the waiting lounge. Flight 745 from New York to Los Angeles is now boarding. First-class passengers, please proceed to the gate. Marissa stood, gently picking up her worn leather bag, and walked toward the boarding gate. She felt the curious glances as she passed through the crowded area. Her composed demeanor and understated confidence stood out amidst the noisy, hurried throng. Entering the first-class cabin, Marissa paused for a moment, taking in her surroundings. Spacious cream-colored leather seats, soft amber lighting, and an air of tranquility marked the luxurious atmosphere. Yet what struck her most wasn't the opulence. It was the indifferent, even slightly surprised, glances from some of the other first-class passengers. Marissa remained unbothered. She continued to her seat, two-way, by the window. Carefully placing her bag in the overhead compartment, she settled into her seat, adjusting herself with quiet precision. A short while later, Brian Jacobs, the lead flight attendant, entered the first-class cabin to check passengers' tickets. Brian was a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed hair and a polished smile that had become second nature during his 15 years in the airline industry. He prided himself on his professionalism and ability to handle any situation with grace. As Brian approached Marissa, his practiced smile faltered slightly. He studied her, his eyes briefly scanning her modest brown coat and simple long skirt. His gaze lingered on her composed expression, as if searching for something that didn't quite fit. "Excuse me, ma'am," Brian began, keeping his tone polite but unable to mask his subtle skepticism. "Could I see your ticket, please? It's possible there's been a mix-up with your seat assignment." Marissa looked up, her calm eyes meeting Brian's. There was no anger or surprise in her expression, only a faint smile as she replied, "No, this is my seat, but if you'd like to check my ticket, here it is." Reaching into her coat pocket, Marissa retrieved her first-class ticket and handed it to Brian with steady hands. Brian took the ticket, inspecting it thoroughly. He flipped it over, cross-checked the information on his control screen, and paused for a moment. His brows furrowed briefly as he confirmed that the ticket was indeed valid. Returning the ticket, he forced a polite smile back onto his face. "Oh, I see. Well, I hope you enjoy your flight." Marissa took the ticket and gave a slight nod. "Thank you." I hope so, too. Brian turned and walked away, but a nagging feeling lingered in his mind. He had worked countless flights and interacted with all kinds of first-class passengers, yet there was something about Marissa, her simplicity, her quiet confidence, that unsettled him. Back in the service area, Brian whispered to his colleague, a young flight attendant named Michelle. Did you notice the passenger in two-way? She doesn't seem like someone who usually flies first class. Michelle glanced toward the first-class cabin, shrugged, and replied, maybe someone bought the ticket for her, or she used loyalty points. Either way, as long as her ticket checks out, it's not our business. Brian nodded, but he couldn't shake the sense that there was something unusual about Marissa. Meanwhile, Marissa sat quietly in two-way, her eyes gazing out of the window. She hadn't heard Brian and Michelle's hushed conversation, but she could feel the subtle difference in how people perceived her. She exhaled softly, thinking to herself, prejudice again, but I'm used to it by now. Marissa didn't dwell on the skepticism around her. For her, today's flight wasn't an opportunity to prove herself. It was a step in a far greater journey, a journey of change. The plane had reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt signs turned off, and the flight attendants began their service in the first-class cabin. The passengers, now more relaxed, sipped carefully curated drinks and enjoyed the promise of an exquisite dining experience. Marissa, seated quietly in two-way, observed those around her. The first-class passengers, some engrossed in their laptops, others savoring glasses of fine wine, carried an air of distance. Though no one directly confronted her, the occasional glances in her direction held a cold curiosity, as if silently questioning her presence in their midst. A short while later, Brian Jacobs, the lead flight attendant, approached with the beverage cart. He placed a glass of water on the table beside Marissa with a tone that was professional yet rigid. Here's your water, ma'am. Marissa looked up, offering him a calm smile. Thank you, but I'd prefer a cup of hot tea, if that's available. Brian hesitated for a moment, then quickly nodded. Of course, I'll get that for you right away. He turned and walked away, but instead of preparing the tea immediately, he leaned toward his colleague Michelle and muttered, isn't it funny? She's trying so hard to act like she belongs here. Hot tea? Really pushing it, huh? Michelle raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, though her discomfort at Brian's comment was evident in her expression. About 30 minutes later, the attendants began serving meals. In first class, the plates were elegantly presented on fine china, featuring a menu that included imported wines, warm crusty bread, and entrees like Wagyu steak or Norwegian salmon. Marissa waited for her meal, but when Brian arrived at her seat, the tray he placed on her table looked nothing like the others in the cabin. It was a standard economy meal in a plastic container, a dry chicken sandwich and a can of soda. Marissa glanced up, her calm demeanor unwavering though her eyes showed a flicker of doubt. Excuse me, but I don't think this is my meal. Feigning surprise, Brian let out a forced chuckle. Let me check on that. Must have been a mix-up. He picked up the tray and turned away, but not before whispering to Michelle, who stood nearby. It's just a sandwich. What more could she possibly want? This time Michelle frowned and couldn't hold back. Brian, I think you need to be more careful. We shouldn't treat anyone this way. Brian shrugged dismissively. Oh, come on. You can't tell me she doesn't seem out of place. Look at her. She doesn't belong here, and you know it. Michelle didn't respond, her discomfort growing as she walked away. When Brian returned with the correct meal, he placed the tray on Marissa's table without offering an apology. Marissa didn't need one. Her eyes met Brian's briefly, her gaze steady and knowing. It was clear she had seen everything, from the intentional mistake to his unprofessional attitude. She smiled, a serene yet resolute smile, and said, "Thank you. I hope the other passengers receive the same level of attentive service." Brian stiffened at her words but quickly regained his cold, indifferent expression before walking away. Marissa watched him retreat, feeling neither anger nor hurt. What she had experienced today was just another small instance of the prejudice she had faced throughout her life. She understood that Brian's actions weren't entirely his own. They were rooted in a larger system of ingrained biases. Throughout the flight, Marissa noticed Brian and some of the other crew members whispering amongst themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction. Though she couldn't hear their words, their demeanor made it clear she was the subject of their discussion. In another corner of the cabin, a young woman in a sharp business suit quietly observed the interactions. Her brow furrowed as she noticed how the crew treated Marissa. Though she remained silent, her unease with the situation was evident. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Richard Dawson, the CEO of the airline, sat unnoticed in a window seat near the back. Dressed modestly to avoid attention, he preferred to observe his company's operations discreetly. Richard had no idea he would witness something extraordinary on this flight. But from the moment he boarded, he noticed discrepancies in the crew's attitudes toward passengers. Now, seeing how the staff repeatedly acted unprofessionally toward one particular first-class passenger, he felt compelled to watch even closer. In the economy cabin, Richard Dawson, the CEO of the airline, sat quietly in a window seat, an open book resting in his hands. He had chosen this flight as part of his usual routine, observing his company's service from the perspective of an ordinary passenger. Richard was accustomed to keeping his identity concealed when flying. Each time he took a seat in economy class, watching the cabin crew and experiencing the service firsthand, he would notice details that no formal reports could capture. But today's flight was different, and not because of the food quality or the crew's demeanor toward him, but because of how they treated a particular passenger in first class. From the moment he boarded, Richard had noticed Marissa Blake. Her understated appearance made her stand out in an unusual way, not due to ostentation, but because of the stark contrast to the polished image of other first-class passengers in tailored suits, expensive watches, and luxury laptops. Throughout the flight, Richard observed the crew's attitude toward Marissa. He noted every detail, the excessive scrutiny with which Brian Jacobs, the lead flight attendant, had examined her ticket, the unnecessary delay in serving her tea, and even the meal mishap he had witnessed from afar. Richard exhaled quietly. As a CEO, he understood all too well how prejudice could infiltrate even the most meticulously designed systems. What bothered him, however, was the lack of professionalism displayed by a crew trained to treat every passenger with equal respect. From his vantage point, Richard could see Brian speaking with the other attendants. Though he couldn't make out the words, the expressions and body language were enough to convey the mocking tone with which Brian referred to Marissa. Brian appeared unaware that his actions were being watched. His confidence bordered on arrogance, and he spoke of Marissa with an air of condescension. "Look at her. It's like she's trying to prove something." Richard frowned. He knew Brian was an experienced flight attendant, but the man's complacency and lack of empathy left him deeply disappointed. Experience is no substitute for kindness, Richard thought. His mind turned not just to Brian, but to the larger, more troubling issue at hand. How do you change a system so entrenched, where unconscious biases still dictate how people treat one another? Richard recalled recent board meetings where profit margins and revenue figures had dominated the discussions. Yet to him, an airline wasn't merely a business. It was a vessel of human connection, a place where everyone, regardless of their status or background, deserved to be treated with fairness and dignity. The urgency to act weighed on him. He couldn't sit idly by while this unfolded before his eyes. The announcement echoed through the cabin. Flight 745 from New York to Los Angeles has landed. Please check your personal belongings before leaving the aircraft. Thank you for choosing our airline. Marissa rose gracefully from her seat in 2A. She retrieved her worn leather bag from the overhead compartment and allowed herself a small smile as she took one last glance at the first-class cabin. This flight, though filled with moments of discomfort, had reinforced her understanding of the changes she and her son, Nathan, were striving to implement. The other passengers exited in their usual hurried manner, their movements brisk and purposeful. Marissa, however, remained calm and unhurried, walking steadily toward the exit. As she stepped off the plane, a few flight attendants nodded politely, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. The baggage claim area was bustling with activity. Conveyor belts hummed steadily, carrying suitcases in an endless loop, while passengers chattered softly amidst the steady hum of engines. Marissa made her way to Carousel 5, where the luggage from Flight 745 would soon appear. She stood quietly at the edge, her calm demeanor contrasting with the chaotic energy around her. Not far away, Linda Collins and Brian Jacobs stood chatting near the service desk. The flight over, they seemed more at ease, laughing and conversing as if nothing had happened, unaware of the dramatic turn their day was about to take. Linda leaned slightly toward Brian, whispering with a smirk, "Who do you think she is?" The way she sat there in first class, it was like she'd wandered in by mistake. Brian chuckled dryly. Probably got the ticket as a gift. No way she could afford first class on her own. The two shared a laugh, blissfully ignorant of the truth about the woman they had dismissed so easily. The atmosphere shifted abruptly when a group of airline executives entered the baggage claim area. Leading them was Richard Dawson, the airline CEO, who had flown incognito in the economy cabin. His expression was resolute, his movements purposeful, as he was trailed by assistants and senior managers. Linda and Brian immediately straightened their postures, their demeanors snapping to professionalism. But their smiles faltered when they realized Richard wasn't looking at them. His focus was entirely on one person, Marissa Blake. Richard strode directly to Marissa, a genuine smile breaking across his face. He extended his hand in greeting, his voice clear and filled with respect. "Mrs. Marissa Blake, welcome. It's an honor to meet you." Marissa shook his hand gently, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Richard. I've been looking forward to this moment." Nearby, Linda and Brian froze in place, their smiles replaced by wide-eyed shock. Hearing Richard address Marissa by name, they exchanged bewildered glances. Linda whispered hoarsely, "Marissa Blake, who is she?" But before Linda could process the thought, Richard continued, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm delighted to announce that Mrs. Marissa Blake is the airline's largest shareholder. And more importantly, her son, Nathan Blake, is the current owner of the company." Richard's words landed like a bomb, shattering the casual air of the baggage claim area. Linda's jaw dropped, while Brian stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on Marissa as if seeing her for the first time. Neither could believe that the unassuming woman they had mocked and dismissed throughout the flight was at the center of the airline's future. Linda felt a flush of heat rise to her face. Her snide remarks, her judgmental stares, all of it came flooding back as an unbearable wave of shame. She stole a glance at Marissa, hoping desperately that the woman hadn't noticed her earlier behavior. Brian, standing beside her, was equally stricken. He wondered if Marissa had overheard his whispered comments about her attire or his mocking tone about her meal. Regret crept into his chest, but he had no idea how to atone for his actions. Marissa stood silently, her composed presence magnified by the weight of the moment. Her gaze shifted briefly to Linda and Brian, who squirmed under her steady scrutiny. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence was enough to press home the gravity of the situation. But beneath Marissa's calm exterior was a glimmer of steely resolve, a quiet warning that she had no intention of letting this day's lessons be forgotten. The baggage claim area seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Richard Dawson's words, "Mrs. Marissa Blake is the largest shareholder of this airline," rang out like a thunderclap in Linda Collins and Brian Jacobs' minds. Both stood rooted to the spot, their gazes fixed on the woman they had so casually disrespected. Marissa remained composed, her faint smile unwavering. Yet her eyes, sharp and piercing, spoke volumes as they rested on Linda and Brian. She could sense their mounting discomfort, the unmistakable signs of fear and regret etched across their faces. Richard maintained his polite demeanor as he continued speaking to Marissa. "Mrs. Blake, how was your flight? I trust our team performed their duties to your satisfaction." Marissa arched a brow slightly, letting her gaze briefly flicker toward Linda and Brian before returning to Richard. "My flight was memorable. Your team certainly left a lasting impression." Richard frowned slightly, as if catching the subtle edge in her words. Before he could ask further, Marissa turned, her focus now fully on Linda and Brian, who both avoided her gaze, their discomfort palpable. Marissa walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. Linda's feet felt as though they were glued to the floor, her body frozen in place. Brian stared at the ground, desperate to avoid the confrontation he knew was coming. Stopping directly in front of them, Marissa's sharp eyes locked onto theirs. Her voice, calm yet commanding, broke the suffocating silence. "Do you know what the worst thing an airline can do is?" Neither Linda nor Brian responded. The tension between them was suffocating, and neither dared to meet her gaze. Marissa's voice grew colder, each word cutting deeper. "It's judging a passenger by their appearance. And that is exactly what you did." Linda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her face flushed with shame as flashes of her earlier behavior at the check-in counter surged through her mind. Finally, she stammered, "Mrs. Blake, I didn't mean to. I didn't realize." Marissa interrupted, her tone steady yet unyielding. "Didn't realize? Or didn't care? You assumed that because I wore an old coat and carried a bag that wasn't designer, I didn't belong in first class. Do you understand that such prejudice doesn't just insult me? It tarnishes the reputation of this airline." Linda lowered her head, unable to respond. Beside her, Brian felt the weight of the moment bearing down on him. Struggling to steady his voice, he spoke. "Mrs. Blake, I apologize if any of my actions made you uncomfortable. We strive to provide the best service, but perhaps there was a misunderstanding." Marissa's gaze bore into Brian, unwavering. "Misunderstanding? Do you think whispering behind my back or deliberately serving the wrong meal qualifies as a misunderstanding? I saw everything, Mr. Jacobs. And I must say, I am disappointed, deeply disappointed." Brian stood in silence, no excuses left to offer. Richard Dawson, observing the scene, stepped forward. His voice, calm but weighty, broke the oppressive tension. "Linda, Brian, I think you both need to reflect carefully on your actions today. What you've done goes against the values of this airline and betrays the trust we place in our team." Turning to Marissa, Richard's expression softened with respect. "Mrs. Blake, on behalf of the airline, I offer you my sincerest apologies. I assure you, we will take every measure to ensure incidents like this never happen again." Marissa nodded lightly. "I hope so, Richard, because an airline doesn't just transport people from one place to another. It carries trust, kindness, and responsibility for every passenger. If your team can't deliver that, then all the changes Nathan is working so hard to implement will be for nothing." Linda and Brian stood motionless, their faces pale. Marissa's and Richard's words weren't merely reprimands. They were a wake-up call, a reminder of the core values they had failed to uphold. Marissa turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence laden with regret and reflection. Her stride was calm, yet resolute, her gaze unwavering. In her eyes was a determination, a quiet reminder that the most profound lessons often come from the smallest, yet most revealing, mistakes. The atmosphere in the baggage claim area had yet to return to normal. The weight of Marissa Blake's reprimands and Richard Dawson's announcement hung heavily in the air, leaving Linda Collins and Brian Jacobs stunned. Their pale faces betrayed the shame they felt, and neither dared to meet anyone's eyes. Marissa turned to face Linda and Brian. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes carried a sharpness that could not be ignored. "Linda, Brian," Marissa began, her voice slow yet deliberate, each word carrying weight. "I want you both to understand that what happened today isn't the first time I've faced prejudice. And I can guarantee you, I'm not the only one." Linda lowered her gaze to the floor, while Brian stared down, unable to meet Marissa's steady gaze. Marissa continued, her tone unwavering. "What disappoints me the most isn't how you treated me. I've grown accustomed to judgmental stares and mocking words over the years. What truly disappoints me is your lack of respect for your work. Your lack of respect for the passengers you are supposed to serve." She turned to Linda, her gaze cold and cutting. "Linda, do you know this? A small gesture, like a genuine smile or a kind word, can transform a passenger's entire experience. But you chose to do the opposite. You allowed your biases to overshadow your responsibility and professionalism. Linda swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she managed to respond. Mrs. Blake, I'm truly sorry. I didn't realize. Marissa raised an eyebrow, interrupting her. No, Linda, you did realize. You knew exactly what you were doing, but you chose to ignore what was right in favor of indulging your prejudices. Turning to Brian, Marissa shifted her gaze to Brian, who was struggling to maintain composure but couldn't hide his discomfort. Brian, you're the lead flight attendant. Your team looks to you for guidance. You set the standard for service on every flight. And what did you do? You chose to mock a passenger. You chose to make your whispered remarks the lesson your team would follow. Do you think that's worthy of the role you hold? Brian opened his mouth, as if to say something, but the words failed him. Marissa took a deep breath, her eyes scanning both of them before she spoke again, her voice steady and firm. Remember this. Every passenger who boards your plane carries their own story. You don't know what they've endured to be here, or how much they deserve respect. Your job isn't to judge them. It's to ensure that every passenger feels welcome and valued. That is the true meaning of service. Linda and Brian remained silent, knowing no excuse could undo the truth of her words. The only thing left for them to do was listen and learn. Richard stepped forward to stand beside Marissa, his voice low but resolute. Linda, Brian, what happened today won't end here. We will conduct a thorough investigation and take appropriate actions to ensure this airline's culture changes for the better. But I want you both to understand that this isn't just a lesson for you. It's a lesson for the entire system we operate. He paused, his tone softening as he turned to Marissa. Mrs. Blake, thank you for reminding us of the core values of this industry. I promise you, we will not allow these mistakes to happen again. Marissa nodded slightly, her voice calm, but filled with resolve. I hope so, Richard. Remember, change doesn't begin with sweeping policies. It begins with how we treat every individual, especially the ones who seem the smallest. Marissa turned and walked away, leaving Linda and Brian in heavy silence. Her words weren't just a reprimand. They were a wake-up call, a profound reminder of the values they had failed to uphold. Linda whispered to herself, barely audible. She's not just a shareholder. She's someone we need to learn from. Brian didn't respond, but he knew deep down he could never see his job the same way again. As Marissa exited the airport, she left behind more than just silence. She left a lesson, one that resonated far beyond Linda and Brian, reaching the entire system they served. Change would take time, she knew, but today was a start, a reminder that respect is never optional. The air in the baggage claim area remained heavy with tension. What had just unfolded left Linda and Brian stunned, while drawing the attention of several other passengers nearby. Marissa Blake, the woman they had judged and dismissed, had revealed herself not only as a passenger, but as the airline's most powerful stakeholder. Marissa turned and faced Linda and Brian directly. Her usual calm demeanor remained, but her eyes held a gravity that was impossible to ignore. Linda, Brian, she began, her voice measured yet piercing. I want you both to understand that what happened today isn't the first time I've encountered prejudice. And I can assure you, I'm not the only one. Linda cast her eyes to the ground, while Brian stared intently at the floor, avoiding her gaze. Marissa continued, her tone steady but heavy with disappointment. What disappoints me most isn't how you treated me. I've grown used to the stares and the mocking words. What disappoints me is your lack of respect for your work. Your disregard for the passengers you are responsible for serving. She turned her sharp gaze to Linda. Linda, do you realize that something as simple as a sincere smile, a kind word, can transform a passenger's experience entirely? Yet you chose the opposite. You let your bias cloud your judgment and your professionalism. Linda swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. Mrs. Blake, I'm truly sorry. I didn't realize. Marissa arched an eyebrow, cutting her off. No, Linda, you realized. You knew exactly what you were doing, but you chose to ignore what was right, favoring the comfort of your own prejudice instead. Marissa then turned her attention to Brian, who was struggling to maintain his composure. though the strain showed clearly in his face. "Brian, you're the lead flight attendant. Your team looks to you for guidance. You set the standard for service on every flight. And what did you do? You mocked a passenger. You allowed your whispered insults to become the example your team would follow. Do you think that reflects the responsibility of your role?" Brian opened his mouth to respond, but found no words, the weight of her truth silencing him. Marissa took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over both Linda and Brian. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "Remember this. Every passenger who boards your plane carries their own story. You don't know what they've endured to be here, or how deeply they deserve respect. Your job is not to judge them, but to ensure every passenger feels welcomed and valued. That is the true meaning of service." Linda and Brian remained silent. They knew there were no excuses that could erase the truth of what they had done. All they could do now was listen and learn. Richard stepped forward to stand beside Marissa, his voice low but firm. "Linda, Brian, today's events will not simply end here. We will conduct a thorough review and take the necessary steps to ensure that the culture of this airline changes. But I want you both to know this isn't just a lesson for you. It's a lesson for the entire system we operate in." He paused, his expression softening as he turned to Marissa. "Mrs. Blake, thank you for reminding us of the core values of this industry. I give you my word. We will not allow mistakes like this to happen again." Marissa inclined her head slightly, her voice resolute yet calm. "I hope so, Richard. Remember, change doesn't begin with grand policies. It begins with how we treat each individual, especially those who seem the smallest." Marissa turned and walked away, leaving Linda and Brian standing in a suffocating silence. Her words weren't just a rebuke. They were a profound wake-up call. Linda whispered softly, as if speaking to herself, "She's not just a shareholder. She's someone we need to learn from." Brian didn't respond, but he knew deep down that he could no longer see his role through the same lens. As Marissa exited the airport, she left behind more than silence. She left a lesson that resonated not just with Linda and Brian, but with the very system they served. She knew change would take time, but today had been a start, a reminder that respect is never optional. In the airport press room, the glare of countless camera flashes and video lights illuminated the space. Journalists from major outlets like the New York Times, CNN, and Forbes filled the room, eager to cover the seismic event surrounding one of America's largest airlines. Before the podium stood Marissa Blake, her posture straight and composed. Her eyes, calm yet brimming with unwavering determination, surveyed the sea of reporters. Questions flew from every direction, but Marissa raised her hand, signaling for silence. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice warm yet resonant. "I stand here not to defend my reputation, but because I feel compelled to speak for those who don't have the opportunity to do so." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, each word deliberate. "On a recent flight, I experienced something deeply thought-provoking. Not because of the unprofessional conduct I encountered, but because it served as a stark reminder that prejudice and disrespect still persist in our society. This isn't just my story. It's the story of millions who are judged by their appearance, their background, or the way they show up in the world." The room was silent, the air heavy with the weight of her words. She continued after a brief pause. "It's time for change. It's time for organizations, companies, and individuals in society to recognize that respect is never optional. An airline isn't merely a service provider. It must be a space where every passenger, no matter who they are, feels valued and treated with fairness." No interruptions came. The journalist sat riveted, hanging on her every word. "I'm not here to cast blame on anyone," she said, her tone resolute. "I'm here to call for a cultural shift, not just in aviation, but across industries. We need to build a world where kindness and fairness are the norm, not the exception." When she finished, reporters raised their hands in unison. A journalist from the New York Times spoke first. "Ms. Blake, do you believe this issue is an isolated incident, or does it reflect a larger systemic problem?" Marissa responded, her voice steady but firm. "This is not a personal issue. It's a reflection of biases deeply rooted in our collective thinking for far too long. The problem lies within the system: how we train, how we set standards, and how we evaluate people. Change must come from the ground up, starting with the smallest actions and sustained over time. Another journalist from CNN followed. Do you think the airline's actions, suspending employees and holding this press conference, are enough to address the issue? Marissa replied with conviction. This is just the beginning. Suspending employees is a necessary step to establish accountability, but the greater challenge lies in transforming organizational culture. I believe Richard Dawson and his leadership team are committed to this reform, and I will be watching closely to ensure today's words are translated into meaningful action. Marissa's responses earned nods of agreement from many in the room. Reporters jotted down notes, their expressions reflecting a mixture of admiration and contemplation. Meanwhile, on social media, the live stream of her speech began to spread rapidly, with thousands of comments pouring in. She's brave and profound. This is exactly what we need in today's world. Change doesn't come from words alone, but Marissa Blake is doing more. She's inspiring action. Hopefully, other organizations take a page from this playbook. As Marissa concluded her remarks, Richard Dawson stepped forward, standing beside her with a nod of respect. Turning to the reporters, he addressed the room. Our airline is committed to enacting profound change. Incidents like this are unacceptable, and we will not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Today, we've learned a significant lesson, and we are inspired by Ms. Blake's call for action. I pledge that we will follow through to earn her trust and the trust of our customers. Marissa stepped down from the podium, but her words continued to echo. Her speech didn't just resonate within the press room. It ignited a broader conversation, one that rippled through the public consciousness and demanded change on a much larger scale. Deep in her heart, Marissa knew this was only the beginning. But every journey begins with a first step, and today, she had taken that step with purpose and conviction. After an impactful press conference, Richard Dawson and Marissa Blake walked into a small hall where journalists and senior airline executives had gathered to hear the next critical announcements. The room's lighting focused on the podium where Richard stood tall, ready to unveil a series of new policies agreed upon by the leadership team. Marissa stood by his side, her expression calm, but her eyes resolute, prepared for the sweeping changes ahead. Richard began to speak, his voice warm yet commanding. Today is a momentous day for our airline, not because of the mistakes that have been made, but because we now have the opportunity to confront the deeper issues within our organizational culture and commit to transforming them. I am honored to introduce our Corporate Culture Renewal Program, a pivotal step toward creating a workplace that is equitable, diverse, and inclusive. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the attentive audience. This program is not just a collection of policies. It is a promise that we will not tolerate any form of discrimination at any level or position within this company. Richard outlined the key components of the initiative: diversity and inclusion training. Every employee, from cabin crew to senior executives, will undergo mandatory training sessions focused on cultural awareness, diversity, and inclusive practices. These programs will be held regularly to ensure that everyone understands and embodies our core values. Zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Any actions that violate principles of fairness, no matter how minor, will be thoroughly investigated. Offenders will face serious consequences, ranging from warnings to termination. Internal reporting channels. Employees and passengers will have straightforward ways to report concerns or complaints related to discriminatory behavior or service attitudes. All reports will be reviewed by an independent counsel to guarantee transparency and impartiality. Re-evaluating organizational culture. A team of experts will be engaged to audit and assess every aspect of the company's operations, from recruitment to training and promotions, to eliminate systemic biases or inequities. As Richard concluded, Marissa stepped forward, her voice steady and clear, adding depth to the vision. The policies Richard just outlined are not mere promises. They are a commitment to action. But you must understand that true change doesn't reside in rules or processes alone. It begins with attitudes, perspectives, and the way each individual values others. She paused, her eyes alight with determination as she continued. They say small actions create great change. A kind smile, a respectful word. These may seem simple, but have the power to transform a passenger's entire experience. I believe that if each person in this organization commits to doing what's right, we can build an airline that doesn't just serve passengers but inspires them. A representative from the cabin crew, Michelle Carter, stood to speak. On behalf of the staff, I want to thank Ms. Marissa Blake and Mr. Richard Dawson for giving us the opportunity to reflect and correct our mistakes. We pledge to fully participate in these training programs and to act toward creating a better workplace environment. The other employees nodded in agreement. They understood that these changes were not just responsibilities, but also chances to work in a professional and dignified environment. The airline's announcement quickly made headlines. Leading U.S. airline commits to comprehensive overhaul following discrimination incident. The New York Times, Marissa Blake, the woman spearheading an aviation culture revolution. Forbes, a big lesson in customer service. Respect is never optional. CNN, on social media, clips of Marissa's speech went viral, garnering millions of views and thousands of positive comments. Thank you, Marissa, for speaking the truth and acting for a greater cause. This is the kind of leadership we need, strong, decisive, and deeply human. As the press conference concluded, Marissa walked out of the hall with a sense of fulfillment. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she believed today's solid first step was enough to drive lasting change. We can't change the world in a day, Marissa thought to herself. But with enough people striving together, we can create profound and meaningful differences. The soft afternoon sunlight stretched across the airport grounds as Marissa Blake stepped through the large glass doors. After the tense and momentous events of the day, she drew in a deep breath, savoring the liberating air. The space before her seemed vaster than ever, as if the sky itself mirrored her hopes and determination. A car pulled up to the curb outside. Nathan Blake, Marissa's son, emerged with a polished, confident demeanor. His eyes shone with pride and reverence as he caught sight of his mother. Walking toward her, he offered a warm smile. "Mom," Nathan said, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "I watched your speech on the live stream. You made me proud." Marissa looked at her son, her gaze tender but filled with resolve. "You know, Nathan," she began, her voice carrying a quiet strength, "what I did today wasn't for me. I did it for people like us, and for those who will come after us. I want you to remember this. Fairness and respect are not luxuries. They are what everyone deserves." Nathan nodded, his eyes bright with understanding as he absorbed her words. Taking her hand in his, he spoke with conviction. "You've always taught me to treat everyone with fairness, no matter where they come from or what they look like. Now it's my turn. We're going to transform this airline into a symbol of equity and inclusion." Marissa smiled, giving his hand a firm squeeze. "That's right. But remember, this isn't just for us. It's for everyone, for those who've been judged, overlooked, or dismissed simply because of how they appear. We must do what's right." A week later, at the airline's headquarters, Marissa and Nathan appeared together at a highly anticipated press conference. The auditorium was packed with reporters, investors, and airline employees, all anxiously awaiting the important announcements from the Blake family. Nathan, exuding confidence and resolve, stepped up to the podium. He began with a heartfelt expression of gratitude. "First and foremost, I want to thank everyone for being here today. More importantly, I want to thank my mother, Marissa Blake, who has taught me that respect and fairness are the foundation of all rightful actions. My mother is not only the largest shareholder of this company, but also the greatest inspiration in my life." He paused, his gaze shifting toward Marissa, seated in the front row. She met his eyes with an encouraging smile. "As many of you know," Nathan continued, "we are committed to ensuring that incidents like the one we recently faced will never be repeated. Therefore, I am proud to announce that from this day forward, this airline will stand as a symbol of fairness, inclusivity, and respect for humanity. We will not just talk about change, we will enact it." Nathan proceeded to outline additional initiatives for the company's cultural reform program. Support for employees seeking to make amends. Linda and Brian, along with all other employees involved in the recent incident, will have the opportunity to participate in an intensive retraining program. If they demonstrate genuine change in mindset and actions, they will be given a second chance to rebuild their careers. Enhanced transparency. An independent committee will be established to oversee the enforcement of the zero-tolerance policy against discrimination. Quarterly reports will be made publicly available to employees and stakeholders, ensuring accountability at every level. Investing in community support. A portion of the airline's profits will be allocated to educational organizations that promote diversity and inclusion across various industries. When Nathan finished speaking, the room erupted into thunderous applause. Marissa stepped up to the podium, standing beside her son. She surveyed the crowd, feeling the ripple of change reflected in the expressions before her. What Nathan just shared is not merely a commitment. It is a promise we will fulfill, not only as leaders of this company, but as individuals who want to create a better world, she began. She paused, her gaze thoughtful but resolute as she continued. Never judge others by their appearance. Small actions born from prejudice can have profound consequences. And organizations like ours must stand up to ensure that every person is treated with the respect they rightfully deserve. Her speech concluded to prolonged applause. Marissa turned to Nathan, clasping his hand as a quiet reminder that their journey was far from over, but they were on the right path. As the press conference came to a close, Marissa and Nathan stepped out of the auditorium together. The radiant sunlight bathed them, a symbolic gesture of a new beginning. A reporter approached Marissa, asking, "Ms. Blake, is there anything you'd like to say to those following this story?" Marissa paused, offering a gentle smile as she replied, "Respect is not a privilege. It is a necessity, and if each of us commits to acting with fairness, I believe we can change this world." Nathan smiled, giving the reporter a polite nod before turning to his mother. "We did it, Mom," he said softly. Marissa responded with a light squeeze of his hand. "This is only the beginning, son, but I believe we are on the right path." The two stepped into the waiting car, carrying with them a steadfast resolve and hope for a brighter future. The story of Marissa Blake serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of respect and fairness in modern life. In today's society, prejudice and judgment based on appearances still persist, inflicting unnecessary harm. To take inspiration from her story, each of us must learn to listen and empathize before making any judgments. Treat others with kindness and fairness, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Small gestures, a sincere thank you, a genuine smile, can transform the way the world works. This story is just the beginning. Stay tuned for more inspiring and impactful stories in our upcoming videos. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more engaging content.